this video, we're going to cover a couple of things about the integument that weren't covered in the last video. You should know the functions of skin at this point. You know, of course, it is a protector from the external environment. And what we're going to talk about today is how we can detect sensation through the skin. This was mentioned in the last video too, but we're going to talk about the specific cells that we find in our epidermis to help us with this. Of course, we can absorb or obtain vitamin D from the sun, and that requires the skin to do that. And when we get vitamin D, this mechanism is actually not very well known, but the mechanism of vitamin D helps us absorb calcium, which throughout this class and through physiology, you will learn that calcium is really important for body function. And then these two kind of go hand in hand, and it was mentioned a little bit in the last video, but our skin can regulate body temperature, and maybe you can think of sweating or shivering in that instance. But another way that our skin can regulate body temperature is by blood storage, and we will discuss that as well. So I want you to think about this because I'm sure a large proportion of you might have a tattoo. How you get a tattoo and how you remove a tattoo. So here's a little story. Lynn got her boyfriend's name tattooed on her back, but then they broke up. What options does she have to get rid of her tattoo? How does the process work? So perhaps you've heard of tattoo removal before. Think about how it might work. And so you should know by now that we have three major skin areas. We have the epidermis, which is most superficial. We have the dermis sandwiched in the middle. And then deep to that, we have the subcutaneous or subcu, aka the hypodermis layer. And so we're going to talk about each of these layers. And so the video discussed each of these layers. We're going to talk about the cells that we find in the epidermis, and then maybe some components of the dermis. Perhaps you've heard of first, second, and third degree burns. And these correspond with the damage that occurs to the respective layers. A first degree burn, which is a sunburn, impacts only the epidermal layer, which is epithelium. A second degree burn affects the epidermis and dermis, and what you can actually see happening is the dermal layer may lift from this hypodermis layer. It actually lifts. And so you can see like a blister forming, and maybe a blister can form with fluid in it, as you can see in this little kid's finger over here. And then a third degree burn is the most life-threatening of them all because it impacts all three layers, the epidermis, the dermis, and the underlying subcutaneous or hypodermal layer. You should think about why this may be life-threatening, because what would be beneath our subcutaneous layer? So the major goal of this video is to talk more about the 4 types of cells that we find in the epidermis. So again, this is just the epithelial layer, the stratified squamous epithelial layer. And so we're going to talk about each of these 4 major types and why they are important, what their job is. We're basically going to go from most common to least common. And so the very most common type here are those stratified squamous epithelial cells, which we call keratinocytes because they produce keratin. Maybe you've heard of that word keratin before. It is a protein that provides durability and protection. One interesting thing about the skin is that it is the one area of our body that is dry. It is capable of being dry. Everywhere else in our body is wet, it's moist. And the reason why our skin is capable of being dry is thanks to this durable protein, keratin. The second most common cell type are melanocytes, and just like the last video stated, they produce these melanin pigments. And just FYI, there are multiple different types of melanin. There's brown melanin, red melanin, yellow melanin, black melanin, and that's what allows for the rainbow of skin color that we see in the human population. So there's not just one type of melanin. So these melanocytes pass off melanin to keratinocytes, and these keratinocytes are going to collect melanin, and they actually cover up the nucleus like so to protect them. Because think about what is important in the nucleus. DNA, right? There's DNA in the nucleus that is important, that is susceptible to damage. And so melanin granules protect the DNA from UV radiation. The sunlight, sunlight is UV radiation. And so this is why individuals with more melanin have a natural protectant to the sun and have less likelihood of skin cancer. And the opposite is true too. Individuals who have fairer skin have a higher susceptibility to skin cancer. So melanin is produced by melanocytes, and melanocytes are mostly found in the deepest layer of the epidermis, the stratum basal. This is one right here. And that's because they need to pass off the melanin when keratinocytes are first produced, and that is at the stratum basal. This is where mitosis is occurring. And just an aside, every single person has melanocytes. The only difference between different colors of the skin is how much melanin these melanocytes actually produce. We have two cell types left. Intraepidermal macrophages. We don't have many of these. And they are macrophages. And this word will come up often when we talk about the immune system. But they are an immune response against microorganisms in the skin. And by the way, we have millions of microorganisms in our skin, right? Most of them live symbiotically with us, but there are some that, may cause infection, and this is what our intraepidermal macrophages are for. These are easily damaged by the UV. And then last, we have the least numerous amount of cells. These are called tactile epithelial cells, aka Merkel cells. They're also called Merkel cells. And they are in the deepest layer of the epidermis, where they can contact a sensory neuron. And this is what allows us for a sensation of touch. And depending on their location, they're in the deepest layer. Depending on where the sensory neuron is, this can be for light touch or deep touch or firm touch. The 5 layers of the epidermis are the stratum corneum, the stratum lucidum, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and stratum basal, from superficial to deep. I'm drawing a line here just to show that this is the epidermis, and then deep to this we expect to find the dermis, so that's connective tissue. Each layer has, a characteristic of their own, and let's just talk about these really fast, and I'm going to go from deep to superficial. So as I mentioned earlier, stratum basal is where mitosis is occurring. This is where our epithelial cells divide. And maybe you can tell here, like, this looks interesting. We know that this is stratified squamous epithelium, yet down here, these look cuboidal. And that's something that you're gonna see for any stratified epithelium. The youngest epithelial cells that are still doing mitosis, they don't look the shape that they should. They look cuboidal. Young epithelial cells are always going to look cuboidal, as they do here, right? So when you're trying to figure out what shape they are, look to the apical surface. So the stratum basal is unique because mitosis is still occurring here a lot. And I will say that it takes about 28 days for us to fully replenish our whole, all of the layers of the epidermis. Superficial to the stratum basal, we have the stratum spinosum, as you can see here. And the stratum spinosum is called that because they kind of start to look a little spinier. They're going from a cuboidal shape, and maybe they're losing a little bit of the cytoplasm inside. They start to look a little more rigid. There may be a little bit of mitosis occurring here, but not nearly as much as stratum basal. Superficial to the stratum spinosum, we have the stratum granulosum. Stratum granulosum is called that because it looks granular. Notice in here you can see these, kind of dots. You can see granules. It's drawn over here really well. And this is a big turning point for our epithelial cells, for our keratinocytes, because this is where they go to die. So what that means is that everything superficial, the cells superficial to this are all dead. And you can see that here. They don't have their nuclei, right? You can't see their nuclei here. But down here, you can. So the stratum granulosum is a big turning point. This is where cells commit cell suicide or apoptosis. Superficial to the stratum granulosum, we have a layer, the stratum lucidum, that is only present in thick skin. So again, that is your palms of your hands and the soles of your feet, the heels of your feet. And it's a pretty thin layer, maybe only about five or six layers there. And then the most superficial layer up top is called the stratum corneum. It's dead, as is the stratum lucidum. It sloughs off. Maybe you've heard of those like spas or where you can exfoliate your skin and you see all this dead skin come off. And when people do that, they're aiming to remove the dead cells of their stratum corneum. We have about 25 to 30 layers of that. So I know he mentioned a mnemonic in his video, and I think it was, "Come, let's get sunburned." I have a California specific one. So Californians love Golden State babies. So since we're all Californians, we can use that if you want. Back to that tattoo talk. As I said, the stratum basal is where mitosis is occurring, and a lot of mitosis is occurring here. So does that mean that we should all get tattoos? You probably know that tattoos don't go away if you get one. And so what that tells us is that when ink is inserted into the skin, it cannot be inserted in the epidermis, because if it were, it would be gone in 28 days. And so what we need to look at are the layers below or deep to the epidermis, the dermis. So we haven't discussed connective tissue yet. That is coming up next, but this kind of gives us a window into what connective tissue looks like. What we're going to find here are a lot of different cells, a lot of different things, period. A lot of different fibers that are going to lend to the structure and strength of our skin. And also a lot of vascularity. A friendly reminder that epithelium is avascular, and it always requires the assistance or the support of connective tissue nearby for its vascularity, for oxygen. So when we look at the dermis, we actually can split it into two parts. There's the papillary region and then the reticular region. So let's talk about these. The papillary region is directly beneath the papilla, the dermal papilla, which are all these hilly parts. We're going to hear this word often, not often, but a couple times. Anytime you see hilly structures like this, it's called papilla. For example, the bumps on your tongue, those are called papilla. So these are called dermal papilla because they're these hilly regions just between the dermis and the epidermis. So this papillary region has finer fibers, like lighter, finer fibers, but it also contains smaller blood vessels, nerve endings, because we talked about those tactile epithelial cells, and those dermal papilla. And then deep to the papillary region, which is down here, we see accessory structures, for example, the hair follicle. You can see sweat glands, oil glands, sebaceous glands. This is a sebaceous gland, oil gland. This is a sweat gland over here. Erector pili muscle. I'll talk about that in just a second. And then larger blood vessels, not as fine as in the papillary layer. And notice that we see these nerve endings for deep touch or firm touch. So you'll discuss this more in lab, but I want to point out these erector pili muscle. Notice that it's a muscle and it's associated with a hair follicle. So one thing that tells us already, it's only in thin skin. Because remember, our thick skin does not have hair follicles. We don't grow hair on our palms of our hands or the bottoms of our feet. Also, that means that these sebaceous glands are only in thin skin. We don't get pimples on the palms of our hands or the bottoms of our feet. So these erector pili muscles are associated with this hair follicle. And what that means is when it contracts, it's going to pull the hair tight. And so if you can guess what this does, this erector pili muscle gives you goosebumps or goose pimples. People call them different things. And this is not as obvious as like shivering or sweating, but it's actually a thermoregulator. It kind of insulates the air around the skin when all of your hair is raised up. Keep the temperature the same around the skin. Last, we have the subcutaneous layer, which is also known as the hypodermis. This is full of adipose, so it is a fat storage area. And if somebody doesn't have a lot of fat, then it is just areolar. And again, we haven't spoken about connective tissue yet, but we will, so I'll come back to that.